going to talk a lot about traceability and transparency. And I have with me Jennifer Bushman. She is the sustainable seafood expert for Fed by Blue, a company dedicated to bringing new ideas and views on how to preserve the bounty of the ocean. And we also have Hari Pulapaka. He's a chef, he's been a restaurateur, he's a cookbook author, and he's also a professor of mathematics. So these are my awesome people. Thank you. Pause for, And like she said, I'm a food writer. I live in Denver, and I write about all sorts of people. I love the subject of sustainability, so this is really exciting for me. I wanted to start out talking with you guys about traceability and transparency in technology and how that's changing and growing right now.
Sure. First of all, thank you, everyone. Good morning to you. Sorry if I'm yelling into the phone. I teach mathematics, so for me, technology is somewhat seamless. I've also been a chef, and I'm a chef, so on the one hand, I would what you might call a locavore, so I would go to the farms and I would go to the fishermen and I would get my stuff from the source, literally. So the steps from the food source to my kitchens was also often very, very short. Having said that, I think technology is frankly the only tool we have to really solve the kinds of problems that Dr. Grandin was alluding to. You know, the notion of creating these wonderful systems grounded in abstraction, correct thinking that then gets implemented with technology is really our only chance, to be honest with you, because we can have great ideas, you know, in boardrooms and classrooms, but they have to make their way to everyday on-the-ground implementation. So a broad sweep of yay technology is where I stand on the matter.
I mean, I know from the Blue Foods perspective, we talked a little bit yesterday about the importance of technology and how much the farms and the fishermen are starting to use this technology. And I think that there are a couple of things that are very, very important. One is blockchain is becoming exceedingly important throughout the entire supply chain. And this unchangeable record, if you're willing to be open to that, really can give a from the ground all the way to the source perspective. I think there's a lot, it's encouraging to see that consumers are starting, and even chefs and distributors and suppliers are starting to use QR codes more, because what we need is that full window that we can only see. I mean, the reality is these supply chains are global, and I don't see that stopping anytime soon. So technology is really that window that's going to help us have security within it so that we can see where an ingredient goes from point A to point B. And in some cases, it's very complicated. So if we were to use feed models, for example, for animals, it's going to take a broader supply chain than just the animal going from point A to point B. We've got to see transparency from what all parts of that supply chain are to get it to that point. And I'm really encouraged by that. And I encourage companies, we should be demanding that companies have that same transparency on their websites so it's easy for us to follow. It's not this black hole.
So how can companies do that? Or what would be the first steps to someone getting their company to be more traceable?
Well, I mean, so it's a very general question, right? So when we speak of a company, are we speaking of a small restaurant like mine? Are you speaking of a multinational company? There are, in some sense, two ends of the spectrum. Are you speaking of an individual with a food cart? And so we're all very seamless with using technology to get paid for what we do. So that's great, but I think, you know, for example, I teach cryptology, among other things, in the mathematics classroom. So blockchain technology has been around for quite some time. I'm not pushing cryptocurrency in any way, but I'm speaking about the broader sense of blockchain technology that touches and in a very secure way has the ability to really map out the supply chains from start to finish. At some level, though, I do think we're a long ways from equity. Right? So when we ask how will a company adapt to what is needed to make their sourcing and what they do transparent and traceable, I'm the champion of, yes, we can do that, and maybe it's top down, I'm not sure, maybe it's bottom up, but I feel like we have to have systems in place that's really something for everyone, right? It can't be like these great solutions for only those who can afford them. And so I'm a big fan of how do we allow for that to happen in the research space, and of course allowing private sector to do what it does. So I feel like we can start small. How does a company do it well? I feel like a company can, for example, be transparent. That's easy.
Is it?
It's easy in spirit. I was transparent. Hey, today the mahi-mahi came from Port Orange, but yesterday's mahi-mahi came from the Dominican Republic. That's just will and intent. Now, it depends a lot on being able to articulate that accurately, because you're only as good as your invoice. You're only as good as your representative. You're only as good as what information you've been fed. But you know, that notion of transparency depends so much on trust. So we're kind of going back to the third word of this conference. You know, we have to trust our sources. And so if I can be transparent as long as I trust my sources. And then the company that's larger and has technology in place can provide that evidence that's grounded in science. But I feel like there's a place for transparency across the board. And I'll be the first to sort of train people on how to do that. You know, I think it's easy to do that. So how does a company do that, just to finish the response? You start by being transparent in the sense of being honest. And then we go from there.
I mean, it's a lot. There's no doubt. And I think that, you know, first and foremost, I think that one of the most important points that was just made was the fact that a lot of times transparency in a supply chain is a privileged option. So when I look in Blue Foods and we're trying to say, you know, we want to have transparency, we want you to engage in certification and recommendation schemes. That transparency comes through third-party audits, like in our space with Fair Trade, for example. That's Thai Union. Thai Union comes in, they come to the farm, they do all of the audits. Those auditing reports, the minute you start them, you agree they're going to be public. No matter how it comes in, thumbs up or thumbs down. But the problem is, just to give you an idea, it costs on average somewhere just south of $100,000 to be certified at a farm level by Whole Foods.
Wow.
So this is a privileged option, which means that the little shrimp farmer in Vietnam that's a family-owned little farmer that wants to have these market opportunities is pretty much cut out of the entire opportunity. So this is where technology helps us. And there are groups like for example, Mark Kaplan isn't here today. He's incredible. He has a group that is called Whole Chain. And one of the amazing things that he started was he said, look, there are a lot of people, no matter where you are, that you have a phone in your hand. So no matter how poor you are, the odds are you've got this opportunity to collect data. And so he got the data companies, through the US State Department, they got the data companies to start giving free data to different people across the globe to report illegal fishing or illegal farming. And it was massive. We did hackathons, he did hackathons throughout the entire world that were through these systems to be able to show them how to use this technology and not put one solution on the entire globe, which isn't fair, but to have them determine how that data should be collected, what data service providers should be utilized, and then through those hackathons, they built a system of reporting. So I would say that one is we have a lot of data collection opportunity because the good news is there's a lot of phones out there. And then there are groups, like in my case, there are groups like eFishery. And eFishery is helping those shrimp farmers in Vietnam to be able to then download what their practices are, and then they put them in that accelerator that we talked about, that reporting mechanism that Global Sustainable Seafood Initiative is trying to do. And then the good news is a supplier, if you looked at even a Walmart, could look at it, look all the way through, see that they have their permits at the village level, and then make a determination, do I want to do in-house, do I want to do inspections on the ground, or am I comfortable with the information that they provided so I can make that purchase? Because the big problem with a Fair Trade or a Whole Foods or any of those is there isn't place-based sustainability that like you said, we have to somehow create an honest system so we can bring in all of the players into it.
That makes a lot of sense. It also sounds almost impossible to do.
It's totally true.
We're dealing with human beings after all, so yes, there's an impossible aspect.
Well, it goes back to the trust that you were saying, because like you have to trust that shrimp fisherman in order to put the information forward.
In an honest way, and I agree, but there is a point where then the supplier, because one of the biggest issues with purchasing is that there's a mandate from a company that has some type of sustainability mandate. But as we talked about yesterday, purchasers often have to make decisions on the ground quickly from price, from what's available. They're actually every day making a decision to either follow that or not. And so I think that there are opportunities with larger companies especially where they can make those decisions. Have I gotten down the rabbit hole and I know enough to comfortably make the purchase, or do I hire whole chain and hire Mark's company to then to get it over the finish line? But there has to be a starting point in a place-based system so that everybody can enter into it.
I agree completely, but I think you just touched on something that really resonates with me, this notion of a very dynamic space. You know, I'll just speak about my chef world for a brief moment. You know, for someone who's constantly watching the clock with everything I do, just so I can get my stuff done, what happens in the marketplace, just with an order of seafood, those decisions that are made by the buyers and through the distribution and back to the consumer, they're so dynamic and they're so impulsive sometimes that to kind of overlay that on technology, the human factor is almost impossible to avoid. And so what's the solution? There isn't one solution. I think we need systems. We need systems that say, we have some checks and balances that are easy to do with technology. Of course, that's easy. Now, what sorts of systems can we encourage? We have to encourage systems. We can't mandate systems, I feel like. We can. I'm not sure you can have much success. You have to encourage systems and incentivize systems, human systems, that allow human beings to make the best possible decisions in the moment, considering how dynamic those decisions have to be. I'm not sure if I'm making sense.
Well, it's also kind of, I'd say it's probably fragile because you're dealing with food. You're dealing with perishable food. It's not like a product like cloth or aluminum. It's like, it goes bad. You can't just like let it sit there for months and months.
It also gets repackaged. I mean, something comes in, so we could say packaging could help. You put the QR codes on the packaging. Hopefully that box has made it all the way from the farmer all the way to whatever the end user is, so that in the restaurant you could scan a QR code and you would know. And I did this with one fish farmer many years ago, where we put a gill tag on it with a QR code. And then you could trace, then when you got the fish, you could scan the QR code. And a gill tag's kind of, I mean, it can be anywhere on the body of the fish, but it's kind of hard to sort of yank it out and say, look, well, if I'm training him to look for the gill tag through the branding and through talking about where that fish came from, and then you get one and it doesn't have it, that's a flag. So there's an education. But the problem is, because the nature of our supply chain is so complex, things get repackaged. Things get changed out. I can send it in that box with the gill tag, but then that distributor decides to put it in their own box and deliver it to him. So,
and I'll just speak to that. And I wonder how many of my colleagues in the industry, the food industry, would take the opportunity to be honest. So for example, they may have already put their special out for the week that says, you know, we're going to have this local lionfish on the menu on Friday. The good news with lionfish is it doesn't really matter where it's from. There's an attempt to kind of, you know, eradicate it from the non-natural areas.
So buy things you
So
know
maybe
you shouldn't
mahi-mahi is a better example. And we already have this, there's already this thing in place that says we're going to have mahi-mahi from, you know, line caught, you know, from Jacksonville, Florida. But instead, that supply doesn't come in, and we have to figure this out because there are reservations out the door, and people are coming in for that special. So you call your fishmonger, and they send you some mahi-mahi. You know very well it's not from Jacksonville, Florida. Will you make that announcement to your guests? Will you offer them the option to still go for that food, considering that they may still make that decision, but will you be honest enough to do that? That's the human shift I'm speaking of. You know, this very raw, basic, human, decent honesty that has to be in place for these traceable and transparent systems to actually work in practice?
And I have to jump in here because mahi-mahi is so interesting. So I have a client that has 13 restaurants, and everybody loves the mahi-mahi taco, right? So the minute they decided that they were only going to support responsibly sourced wild and farmed seafood, I took one look at the mahi-mahi. It was coming off the coast of Ecuador. It was a fishery that was rated red, and you know, really at the end of the day, it's a fishery that needs to be left for the locals, because the locals depend so much on this fish as their only source of protein. So what we started to do with the guests, we switched it to rockfish. Now, rockfish on the West Coast is one of the greatest sustainability stories in conservation that has ever been told, because it was local NGOs, groups like Monterey Bay Aquarium Seafood Watch, and then local fishers that worked together. They had, and with that Monterey Bay Fishermen's Association, they bought some fishermen's boats out. So some fishermen, they don't want to be in it anymore. Give them the option of getting their equity out of the water, right? The biggest part of the equity is in the boat. So they bought boats out. That helped with how the fishery was managed. Yeah. Then they had lesser licenses. You could only fish so much. There was this incredible recovery for the rock fishery. It is one of the greatest stories in the United States of a fish coming back. So we switched to the rockfish. We had a local story that we could tell around the fish instead of the mahi-mahi, and when people complained they love that buttery mahi-mahi, we could say, look, it's our responsibility to leave the fish for those locals that need it so badly.
Add some butter to your rockfish.
Yeah, exactly. And then leave it for those people. But when we told the human story about why it wasn't on the menu any longer, then they seemed to understand. And not only that, but it shortened the supply chain. It supported local fishermen because they're in Northern California. Like, it was a win-win-win. And people loved it. But you couldn't have just switched it and done it because people are like, where's my mahi-mahi taco? You had to actually educate both the kitchen staff on what to look for, the front of the house staff, and then stick with it. Because some people just aren't going to order it anymore. You have to be willing to take the hit.
Well, that kind of leads me into, why is traceability and transparency even important? Like, why are we pushing so hard to do it?
I think we all appreciate honesty and we appreciate accurate information as human beings. I think that's just a basic kind of need that we have, whether it's in a relationship, whether it's in the workplace, whether it's in consumerism, whether it's in what we buy. We get super mad if our shoes are not what they are. So the same should be true for food. I mean, food is basic. In fact, I would argue more basic than any example I've given, any other example I may have given. So since day one, I've talked about why food, I think, defines us in so many ways, more so than anything else, because it's what we must eat every day, all the time, to get going, keep doing all the wonderful things that we do in life as human beings. So why would we want our food to be honest food? Why? I can't think of a reason not, other than it's a business decision or it's some sort of callous kind of approach in the marketplace. As a human being, I can't imagine not being assured that the traceability is I think it's not so much, I don't think traceability is as important as transparency, because I think transparency speaks to trust. If we could just be transparent and we let the market determine what is worth tracing or not. Like, you don't know where this stuff comes from because you can't trace it, but you're being transparent about it. I think that's a good start. If we can get there as a society, I think we're doing well.
Well, I'm just going to add to that, though, there's so much disconnect that people have with food. I mean, you're talking to people here that are all obsessed with food. They know a lot about it. They're not disconnected, but so many people are. So is it important for them?
I don't want to speak for them, but I think it is. How could, I don't know.
Well, I think I'll give you an example. So during COVID, so being involved in the responsible sourcing of food, as we all, I think, are, we had hoped that people would start to care about making purchases for something that's more responsibly raised than not. And we knew that when it came down to it, and Danny and Food Tank have had lots of conversations with Kroger and others, that when it comes down to making a purchase, the reality is in the United States, there are two drivers, and it's price and taste. Now, some of that's starting to shift, and there's probably, it takes more time to explain all of that because COVID shifted how we felt about purchasing. And one of the big things that was interesting was that for those that were purchasing during COVID, the definition of sustainability changed. And sustainability to them meant safety. Because we were really worried. Remember the whole thing about like wipe off your packages? If it was touched by someone who had COVID, then you'd get it in your food or on your counter. And we were all like getting boxes of things and wiping it all down with lemon juice and whatever. But it provided us with something really important, I think, around traceability, which is safety in the supply chain. So one of the reasons why it's important, and I think that, you know, we heard Temple speak about this, and we think about it all the time, is safety and handling when you think about people getting sick from a bag of spinach because you can't trace where that spinach came from. So there's one thing about that, and then I think nutrition, because the reality is that now we know with the way in which things are raised or where it comes from or how it's fed, we have a nutritional element that also becomes important. So I would suggest that there are elements of the food in which and expectations we have from it, and traceability helps us make sure it's fulfilling those promises.
That was very well said. I like the idea of like shifting some of these words to ones that make sense to other people, because some people might hear, oh, this is, you know, a traceable product, and they think, I don't care, but if this is a safe product, brings to mind, okay, well, I should be eating this and not that. I don't know.
Well, and that's one of the big problems, I think, too.
I asked the question, though, if someone's not being transparent about their tracing, what good is that information about tracing? Unless it's based in technology, right? If someone's just making stuff up, yeah, you can trace it, but...
Well, so it sounds like technology is the key to making this an actual viable system where you don't just have to trust your purveyor. There's accountability.
And I think that the responsibility of that is probably on foundations, on certification bodies, and on companies, and not on the farmer on the ground. It is a collaborative effort. How we do this, what's going to be most comfortable, how we gather information. I mean, I sit here with my Fed by Blue hat on, but I'm going to tell you about Kvaroy, the hot dog out there. There are 2 people full-time that work on certifications and recommendations for Kvaroy, and it costs somewhere in the range of $1.5 million to $2 million a year.
Wow. Wow.
So it's not easy to have the NASCAR bumper filled with certifications and recommendations, and part of that is to say, Sodexo, follow one. And then if you go to True Food Kitchen, follow the same one. We've got to somehow consolidate this, because we can't expect the farmer to hold the burden of, well, if I want to be in, if I want to go and sell to one company, I have to have Seafood Watch, and then if I want to sell to another, I have to be Fair Trade certified. Like, it's a very disconnected process to be traceable, and I think that most of the paperwork is pretty similar.
Okay. Now, is there a difference between tracing something on land versus sea?
Oh my goodness.
I mean, abstractly, yes. Logistically, of course, there's a huge difference. But again, speaking of a system, in my mathematics brain, I think it's a similar system, if not identical system. You've got players, you've got variables, you've got flows, you've got networks, and you've got constraints. And the goal is to optimize that and be able to get the information you want in the best way possible. So to me, it's a system, but of course, that's an easy way to explain that, but I think actually implementing it on land versus not on land is probably a different beast.
I mean, there are a lot of things that would come into this, right? I mean, slavery in the supply chain, you've got equity issues, you've got inspection issues, especially it's more and more and more complicated, especially as we get out of the U.S. The shorter your supply chain, the more confidence you're going to have. So when we talk about, shortening that supply chain, when David was talking about yesterday, buying directly from the fishermen, that's the ideal. You're looking them in the eye, you trust them. Maybe they're buying bluefin tuna and it's read by Seafood Watch, but they say there was lots of fish out there. You're making that decision to buy the bluefin. Right? You have that relationship. I think the longer the supply chain, the harder it ultimately is. And I think it's very important to also understand that these systems are also going to have mistakes. And one of the things that I think is happening with those NGOs is that we're really good at shaming them. And if you hear about an inspector getting paid off, whether it's through Marine Stewardship Council or someone else, understand that that guy's on a boat in the high seas and he needs money just like anybody else, and there are going to be mistakes and there are going to be irregularities. But I look at it like a batting average. They're out there doing the hard work, and if they're getting there, a third of the time or two-thirds of the time, and they're out there making the effort, then the last thing I want to see is creating more disruption and concern from the consumer, because we love to pick up the bad story about how somehow that mahi-mahi that day wasn't traceable.
Yeah.
So just realize this is not easy. It is complicated, and we've got, no matter what it is, vegetables, fish, meat, we have to stay in the game, and we have to be supporting those actors that are doing the hard work on the water, the ground, to keep at it, because it's hard not to have those issues.
I'm sure.
I would ask the question, what is the public, and this is a general term, there's not any one of you, but what is the public willing to accept as a as an uncertainty factor when it comes to paying more for food that's traceable? Like, what is good enough? Like, there's a lot of statistics out there, and in the world of medicine, for example, there's always a risk. I mean, your medicine will work with a certain probability, most of the time. So, what is the public willing to pay, accept as risk? A third of the time sounds rough.
Yeah.
That sounds steep, right? So I just raised that question.
But if we could somehow make it so that it was normal for the food to have that, then that third of a time is not so bad, because you're adding that to everything instead of all the bad stuff plus that third
I
of a
agree, as
time.
long as there's some stabilization of the what it costs in the marketplace, right? But those things that have those labels and certifications, I'm a huge fan of certifications, but I also realize the challenges with certifications, that to have something sort of, our cat gets Know Your Farmer chicken from Virginia, right? That's $11 a pound, because I'm in the position to do that. It's a tiny cat that doesn't eat a lot of chicken, so I can do it. But there's a QR code, and I know where that chicken came from. But I pay a lot for that.
Yeah.
So there's that issue.
It's interesting to me, because I think about this when we were talking, the conversation with Nyman Ranch yesterday about labeling, and I think I had even suggested what is worth the real estate when most consumers don't know what those certifications and recommendations mean. And there has been success. I mean, fair trade, we could argue, even for all of the problems, has been a success. I mean, what happened in coffee and what happened in chocolate has been a tremendous success. The fact that now you wouldn't hesitate, you would be like, what? There's no fair trade label on my coffee? It's normal. And where it started was 25 years ago with my friend's company, Equator Coffee, where they were the first ever to meet that fair trade standard. And it was in very boutique grocery stores with these early adopters that thought that it was really cool to have fair trade certified coffee. And now, 25 years later, it's the norm. And believe it or not, 1/3 of consumers, even millennials, Gen X, Gen Y, recognize the fair trade label. What's really interesting is fish and seafood. Those were all around social equity, right? Fair trade. What's really interesting is fish and seafood is the first ever standard with fair trade that has an environmental tick. In order to be in the fair trade seafood system, you either have to be MSC certified, and then all of your labor and background gets audited, or you have to be Aquaculture Stewardship Council certified. So it's interesting to me to see these evolve. It's our responsibility. I think private money, family foundation money, those that are really interested in supply chain should be investing in fair trade so that all fair trade, all seafood, it'd be required for it to be fair trade certified. Let's push all the chips in the middle of the table. Let's invest in it and not have the burden be on the fishermen to figure it out.
I think that sounds great. And we're wrapping up the panel now, but from what I'm hearing is, hopefully one day, it'll just be the norm to be able to scan your QR code and know where it came from. Fingers crossed.
Just like it's the norm now to have fantastic coffee in the room, right? It wasn't the case probably
Coffee
100
is
years ago.
good, so if you haven't had it.
Education, tell the stories so they get rewarded for the effort of being part of that process.
Thank you,
As an
guys.
idealist, I just want to push trust. Trust. It's about trust.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.